We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land. But we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. Oh, your neighbor over there, a bit bewildered, but he cares.
Welcome to Changing Our World. We have a little family here, Mariola and Ernesto Perez. Ernesto, how old are you? 2? No, you're not.
How old are you, Ernesto?
2.
Who's 3? And Avi Chomsky, who, to use a technical term, is the fictive kin, which means
people who are not blood relatives, but who replicate a family relationship. It's an anthropological term.
So these are all kith and kin here. Mariola left Guatemala and ended up in the bedroom that had been abandoned by Avi's son, who went to college. Mariola, you were born in Guatemala?
Yes, I born in Guatemala.
And you were raised in a village where there was fighting, correct?
Yes, it's correct.
I understand it was 2 indigenous villages fighting each other. Why are the indigenous people fighting?
To understand what's happening in Guatemala today, you really have to understand a lot of Guatemala's history. And I would go back 500 years. A lot of indigenous people talk about 500 years of exploitation and resistance. Starting with the Spanish conquest in 1492, and you'll see how fast I do it, there's been a continuous process of creating an economy that is for the benefit of a few foreign elites and for people in other countries, whether it was Spain or in the 1900s, Germany, and by the end of the 1900s, the United States, who are in control of Guatemala's economy and who are trying to use the land and force the indigenous people to work to produce exports that are going to be for the benefit of somebody else, not them. If you go back to 1492, all of the land of Guatemala is inhabited by indigenous people. But when you get to the late 20th century, many hundreds of thousands of indigenous people have been exterminated, have been driven off their lands, and have been driven into the poorest, most unusable lands for export agriculture. So the land base for indigenous communities has been shrunk to a level where the indigenous communities can't survive.
So they were in a fight over territory?
Yes.
And what was that like for you? You were in elementary school at the time. What was it like?
It was pretty scary, and it was like we couldn't have a peace life. We always waiting, like especially in the night when we were sleeping. We have like mirror night. Is it mirror night? Pesadilla?
Nightmares.
Nightmares. And because a lot of people, they just shooting, and it was horrible.
So you were afraid a lot of the time, right?
All the time.
All
and
the
that
time.
time I was like 7 years old.
You went through the village school, which went up to grade 6.
Fortunately, my dad he went in a church where he learned how important education was. So he pushed us up to go to school. When I finished primary, the 6th grade, so he sent us to like a city where I went to continue following my school.
Okay, Avi, so say a young indigenous girl decides she wants to get an education, and she enrolls in a school in a neighboring city, and what happens?
Is it common in your village for kids to go to school?
So in my village, it's hard for parents to send their children in school. Usually, especially
Costs money.
It costs money,
Yeah.
and especially girls, they think that all the women indigenous, they are like a slavery. They only good for have kids.
So what happened when you got to that school?
When I went to that school in the city, it was disappointed because nobody accepted me because I was wearing my dress, my coat.
You were wearing your indigenous clothing,
Exactly.
right?
Yes, I was wearing my indigenous clothes, and it was a horrible experience because I was the only one who was indigenous, and even I couldn't speak any. I mean, I spoke a little Spanish, but my Spanish was broken. So everybody was making fun of me when I speak Spanish, and everybody was unfriendly and lowly. Even some of my teachers, they were like they're like racism too.
And that's because you were indigenous,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
And they felt you didn't deserve to get an education, or?
Because I feel like all people from the city, they know, like all indigenous people, they can't go in the school, especially to finish your high school or go in the city.
They can't picture an indigenous person actually as an educated,
Exactly.
talented person.
Yeah.
So then it's sort of a fulfilling image then, in that it's not possible for indigenous people then to fit comfortably into the settings where they would get the education, right? Mm-hmm. And is that widespread, Avi?
That's absolutely widespread. The kind of racism that exists in Guatemala against the indigenous population, that has expressed itself repeatedly throughout Guatemala's history in extreme violence, torture, disappearance, assassination against indigenous people, especially against indigenous people who challenge the social order or their place in the social order. Again, it's a 500-year-old story, but the most recent version of that story is what happened in the 1980s that maybe some viewers are familiar with, where there were movements among the poor peasants of Guatemala, who are primarily indigenous, to try to have a voice in their society, to try to educate themselves, and the response was a vicious military response that lasted for 15 years, killed hundreds of thousands of people. And this goes back really to the military coup of 1954, where the United States collaborated to overthrow the second ever democratically elected government of Guatemala in order to preserve the export economy, because the export economy depends on maintaining the indigenous population as a subject, virtually enslaved population. And when the government tried to carry out a land reform, the purpose of which was to restore some of this land that had been stolen from indigenous communities and was in the hands of large landowners and U.S. companies, to return some of that to the communities and to create laws that gave rights and voice to poor people and to indigenous people in Guatemala, the United States collaborated with Guatemalan elites to go in and overturn that. It was an unacceptable challenge. In Guatemala, the repression against the population and the punishment for trying to stand up and have rights and have a voice turned into what has been called a virtual genocide in the 1980s. And this is the context that the indigenous communities today are still struggling to overcome.
We think that there are all these sovereign countries, and really the United States is playing, particularly Latin America and South America, like puppets. Mariola, you were pregnant. You were on your own. How were you supporting yourself right before you left?
So since I came in the United States, thank Avi, she accepted me in her home. I was pregnant. I didn't have any money in a, how you say, deuda?
Debt.
I have a big debt behind me. So I had to work to clean house, and I started to take English classes in Salem State.
You have to realize you spoke only Mayan. Then you went to the school, you had to learn Spanish, you arrived here without a word of English. You speak very well.
Oh, thank you. So I started to take some English in Salem State, and then when my son born, I started to deliver newspaper. And then since that, I just started to work because I want to support my life and my son and other thing that in the indigenous, we never have this like cultural, like go to the museum or all this kind of thing. So when I came here, I learned that there is to take my son to the library, to the museum, to swimming lessons and music class. And last week he just started a soccer team in Salem. So, and I working so hard.
And then you were arrested. Do you think she was arrested for murder? How about robbing a bank? Did she attack someone? Did she steal something? What did you do that you got arrested?
So my big crime is driving without license.
That's what they caught you at afterward, but why did they arrest you originally?
So they arrest me because I passed a yellow light.
She went through a yellow light.
I passed the yellow light when I saw a police was behind me. And then I stopped, and then he came through me and he says, do you have your license? But I think he stopped me because he saw me because my hair is black.
Right.
Another man was behind me. He was American people, I think. And he passed the red light and he didn't stop him. So he came and he asked me, do you have your license? I said, I don't have license. So he said, came out and close your car. And so he came. And I was so disappointed for me because he wasn't the only one. He didn't know, I don't know, he didn't know what to do. He called the Salem police, Salem police. So there was like 3 cars, 2 cars behind me and another car in front of me. And all the people in the neighborhood was looking at me. It was like, they arrest me. They pulled me in the car and they took my fingerprints and they supposedly, they said they have me an appointment to go to court on Tuesday. And they said, the only thing you have to do is just to pay a fine, and then you'll be all set and whatnot. But the big surprise I got on Tuesday when I went to the court was that immigration was waiting for me outside the court.
Immigration, called ICE, which spells ICE.
And I feel like they called them because of this program, Secure Community Program. They identified me right away for my fingerprints. So, and they told me that they going to arrest me because of my son. They didn't do this with me. So they just said.
So the only thing that kept them from arresting you was the fact that they didn't know what to do with your little boy who has now fallen asleep.
So they said, who's this boy? Is this your son? And I said, he's my son. Is he a citizen? And I said, yes, he's a citizen. Are you a single mother? I said, yes, I am.
So you went to court, and how many years did they give you for having run this yellow light? What was your sentence?
When I went in, they said they dismissed my case for driving without a license, and I pay a fine. So it was all, but before that,
But now you're really in deep trouble.
Exactly.
Now, Avi, what is a Secure Communities?
It's a misnamed program. It's a program set up by ICE, through the Department of Homeland Security, and it's kind of Orwellian because it's called Secure Communities. The idea is it's going to make our communities more secure. And this is actually, it's part of the Obama administration's attempt to do an immigration enforcement that was different from the Bush era. During the Bush era, some of you might remember, a lot of immigration enforcement, that is the arrest, detention, and deportations, happened through workplace raids.
Oh, right.
Big raids in New Bedford.
And they arrested them, and their children were left with babysitters, and it was scandalous, and it was happening all over the country.
Obama said we're going to have a kinder, gentler deportation policy, but we're going to deport even more people. That is, the Obama administration has put in quotas of trying to deport 400,000 people a year, and they have either met or come very close to meeting those quotas every year. So they're deporting more people than Bush ever deported, but they're doing it more secretly.
Aren't they supposed to be deporting people with criminal records?
Well, that's the idea of secure communities. They said instead of going into the workplace, and Obama has said repeatedly, we do not want to deport people who are just living their lives, supporting their children, working, going to school. Those are not the people we want to deport. We want to deport people who are committing crimes. We want to commit people who are we want to deport people who are a danger to their community, people who are criminals. This is Obama has said over and over. So this program called Secure Communities is this way of making people think that Obama's deportation policies are making us more secure because they're deporting all these dangerous people. But what Secure Communities does is it makes local law enforcement agencies collaborate with ICE. Every person who is booked at a police station for any reason, even in this case, there were charges, but those charges were dismissed. So she was not convicted of any crime. But people are fingerprinted, and their fingerprints are sent to ICE automatically. So if you go into the police station, they take your prints, those are sent to ICE.
We got interrupted because Mariola has not left us to go commit more crimes. Mariola is going to a preschool meeting about her son. So whatever happens, those prints go in, and whether you've murdered someone or run a yellow light, ICE comes to get rid of you, right?
I wanted to explain something else because Mariola mentioned driving without a license. That is, it was running the yellow light that got her stopped.
Right.
But it was driving without a license that got her taken into the police station and fingerprinted. So why was she driving without a license? That's something that U.S. citizens often wonder. So why would anybody drive without a license? I wouldn't drive without a license. The reason is that people who are undocumented cannot get a driver's license. This is also something new. This was Bush-era legislation called the Real ID Act. It used to be that you did not need a social security number to get a driver's license. So people who were undocumented got their driver's license, passed the test, and had a driver's license that they could be identified with. If they committed a traffic violation, it would go on their record because they had a license. This new law, supposedly to make us more secure, makes us more insecure because so there's 12 million undocumented people in the United States. A few states have stood up to the federal government and said, we're still going to allow people who are undocumented to get driver's licenses. And in fact, Vermont just announced that they're going to implement that in January 2014. But in most of the United States, including in Massachusetts, you cannot get a driver's license if you're undocumented.
She broke another law. Why didn't she get a visa to come here?
Why didn't she get a visa to come here? That's a really good question, too, because, again, most U.S. citizens hold U.S. passports, right? It's part of being a U.S. citizen. So when you get your U.S. passport, because I just did this a couple years ago, I had to get a new passport, it comes with a flyer. It says, with your U.S. passport, the world belongs to you. So if you have a U.S. passport, you assume that the world belongs to you. You can use that passport to travel to any country in the world. You want to go there, you just take your passport
and go.
But that's not true for most of the world, especially if you come from a poor country. If you come from a poor country, no rich country is going to let you in, unless you're a member of the small elite in that poor country. So if you have a Guatemalan passport, and if you're an indigenous person from a peasant village, there is no way you can get a visa to come to the United States. There is simply no way. And that is why people cross the border without visas, because they know that there's work here for them. They cannot survive in their home country. Because of historical reasons that are very related to the U.S. relationship with Guatemala. And I should also just point out that if you look at a map of where the U.S. has intervened, and you look at a demographic map of the United States, at where immigrants are coming from, you're going to see a very strong pattern. So there were no Guatemalan immigrants in the United States before the 1980s, before the United States started supporting genocide against the indigenous people directly supporting genocide against the indigenous people
and supporting seizure of their lands
Guatemala.
as well, which have been going on.
When you go to the supermarket, go to Trader Joe's and look at where your bananas come from. Go to Market Basket and look at where your snow peas come from. Those are coming from Guatemala. Those are coming from the lands that were taken from indigenous people. And now we're forcing those indigenous people to come here and work in the back rooms of McDonald's and work in the food processing plant and work in the fields picking our crops. We're forcing them to do it in Guatemala to produce our luxury foods, and we're forcing them to do it here to produce our luxury lifestyle. And we're justifying it with the same kind of prejudice, discrimination, and racism that started way back with the Spanish in 1492. I wanted to say one more thing about secure communities and whether it makes our communities more secure. If ICE is going to arrest people after they're taken by the police for some reason, that means they're going to be taking criminals. But the majority, up to 85% in some studies, of people detained by ICE through secure communities are people who have done nothing that would be considered a crime under ordinary circumstances. They're either driving violations or they're immigration violations. And so, is an immigration violation a crime? No. Being here without papers is not a crime. There is no punishment for being here without papers. The only consequence of... You okay, sweetie? Ernesto has asthma, and I know we only... Okay, okay.
I want to go.
You want to go? We're going to go in just a minute.
We're going to go in a
Here,
minute.
come. Rest on my shoulder for a second.
Tell me about this rally. You seem to have created a big circle of friends around Mariola.
Mariola's case is really a kind of a textbook case of what's wrong with secure communities. That it's picking up people who have lived exemplary lives since they've been in the United States. She's just trying her best to raise her son the best she can and educate herself. In addition, her son has some serious health problems, which you all just heard, asthma, which she has worked so hard to try to control and care for, and which could put his life at risk if he was sent back to Guatemala. So a lot of people were very moved by this case. Mariola has made a lot of friends in the time she's been here. She's been involved in lots of different activities and organizations and met a lot of people and won many people's hearts. So when she was taken by ICE outside the court, they said, you have a deportation order, we're going to deport you. Come on the 17th and we're going to give you your deportation order. So her lawyer prepared to file for a stay of removal, and that would allow her to remain in the country to take care of her son temporarily. So that was what the rally was for. The rally was in support of her petition for a stay of removal, and we're thrilled to be able to say that that stay of removal was granted today. So she is not going to be deported in 60 days, as they told her when she went in on Tuesday that she was going to be
So
deported in 60 days.
do you think the rally made the difference?
I think it's the combination of everything that was done that made the difference. I think the rally and the press conference contributed to letting ICE know that
And
this
articles
is
in the paper.
articles in the paper. She collected a lot of letters of support. Ernesto's preschool teacher talked about how important it was to his development to be able to stay here and to have his mother here.
Tell us a little about yourself.
I'm a professor of history and coordinator of Latin American Studies at Salem State.
And a champion of
Immigrant rights. I do a lot of work on immigrant rights. I wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago called They Take Our Jobs and 20 Other Myths About Immigration. And I do a lot of work with undocumented people, undocumented students, and others who are not students who are undocumented, which led me to write a new book that's going to come out in May called Undocumented, How Immigration Became Illegal. And in some ways I feel like understanding undocumentedness is the key to understanding the history of U.S. political economy in the 20th century. Like up until the 1960s, there really was no such thing as illegal people or illegality. It's something that was a category that was deliberately created by our legal system.
You know,
for economic
it's like
reasons.
a catch-22, which is you set up situations in the home countries where people cannot survive. And then they have no choice but to come here. And then they come here and we make them illegal. So it's like you get squeezed there, you get squeezed here, and these poor people are caught in this trap, in this catch-22.
It's been described as a system of global apartheid. That is, that the United States has created these sort of neo-colonies where
Right.
it traps people and makes them work for them and does not let them leave. It's like a ghetto, a walled ghetto. That's what it's like to live in a third world country, to be a poor person in the third world country. You cannot get out. We will not let you cross those borders and come into this land of privilege. You have to stay there. But there's more to it, because the status of undocumentedness keeps people behind a wall even after they're in the United States. They're behind this wall of marginality, illegality.
And Talk about being afraid all the time when she was a kid. Well, now she's behind the wheel. She doesn't have a license, but you can't have a job in this country without driving a car. And so she's afraid all the time if she gets stopped.
Especially hard to have a child with a health condition when you don't have a car. The solution to people driving without a license is to make it possible for them to get a license.
Right.
And then they would not drive without a license.
So what's it like? Your two kids are in college or beyond, and what's it like having a little one and another woman in the house?
I feel like my children have adopted Mariola as another sister. My daughter said she's like a sister, feels like she's a sister to her. To me, it's like having a grandchild in my house and getting to sort of have
Practice.
all the pleasure of playing with a little one without the responsibility.
That's grandparenthood.
Yeah, I've heard about it. So I wasn't expecting to experience it quite so soon. But here he is, and I adore him. And he's also become a really important part of my extended family. My sister and brother and their kids love him, and my dad especially, Noam, has just become so attached to him. He's the first great-grandchild. My dad always brags. He finally got to have a great-grandchild. Been so impressed with Mariola's determination to do what's best for Ernesto and to succeed here. She's been in school nonstop since she got here. She started taking English classes at Salem State. She went on to take English classes at the Salem Harbor CDC, and then went on to North Shore Community College. And she went to a GED program, and now she's taking an intensive pre-college college readiness program at Operation Bootstrap. So she is working her way towards being able to go to college. And he's in preschool. He goes to the Salem State preschool.
When you say let's get rid of those whatever, you don't realize, that they come here and they can realize their full potential, something that could never have happened in Guatemala. And that she's going to be an exemplary student, especially as part of your family.
So I wanted to say something about where things are at now. We got the wonderful news today that what we were rallying for on Tuesday, the stay of removal, was granted. So she was granted the stay of removal. And that means that ICE made the right decision. They made the humanitarian decision. They exercised their prosecutorial discretion, to use the technical language. And that's wonderful. But it's also scary, because it's discretion. And 2 days ago, they told her in no uncertain terms that they could detain her, put her in prison, and deport her. And today they told her that they're suspending that for a year. So it's wonderful that they're suspending it, but the law shouldn't allow that kind of arbitrariness. We should have laws that protect people, not laws that allow discretion that can help people or could not help people. She definitely feared both for her life and for her son's life if she had to return.
So I hope when you think of secure communities, if you hear anybody speaking about it, that you think of the great insecurity it causes for so many while yielding so few positive results, because sending someone who's run a yellow light back to their country to a horrible situation, it doesn't make any sense, and is causing so much pain to so many of the people among us. Loving people is the way to go. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you so much.
'Cause the problems can all be solved with dedication and a little resolve. Obstacles slowly dissolve when we all just get involved. We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land. But we all lend a hand. We can do it.
Just talking about the arbitrariness of the system. So, I can say that today we got amazingly good news from ICE. We understood that at this meeting on Tuesday it was a check-in where she was just going to be given paperwork, that it was a purely bureaucratic procedure. But instead, they took us into a room, and she was supposed to be meeting with the agent in charge of her case. But when he came out to get her, he was accompanied by somebody who did not identify himself, was not wearing a uniform, did not have a badge, and whose job basically was to try to intimidate the two of us And first he tried to intimidate me. When he got tired of that, he sent me out of the room so that he had her and the baby alone there. And
Vulnerable.
a good 15 minutes
frightened.
basically threatening her in very loud and aggressive ways and saying, you know, we could deport you right now if we wanted to. You know, we detain people like you. And this was before he gave her any paperwork. She had no idea what was going to be done with her when she went into that room.
Right.
And that's the arbitrariness of the way the law works. So,
And not only the arbitrariness, but the unnecessary cruelty, really, you've got a young woman with a baby who's sick and who's worried, and then you make it much worse. For no purpose. I mean, hand her the papers. What does the added anxiety improve in the world? Nothing. Well, I'm very glad that she got the stay. And is there another step now?
you know, we've been focusing so hard on this step, on avoiding the imminent deportation,
Right.
that we're going to have to stop and think now about what are the next
Yeah, what's
steps.
the next step? Well, I wish you luck.
Thanks.
Let me just say that it's really lucky for Ariola, which probably doesn't happen to the many immigrants who are in her exact same condition, to have someone like Ari on her side.
And he loves my dad. He calls him Papa, just like my own kids do.
We had a Pakistani living with us for a year while he was struggling to get a visa also. And he considers us part of, I mean, we're all family. These people, when you get to know them, it's so interesting that as a Muslim, it turned out that being Muslim and being Jewish, when you get down to the basis of the religion, they're not that different. You know something, talking about this particular squeeze there in Guatemala where the land has been taken over to make exports for the U.S. I saw a film about the maquiladores in Mexico, and three family members were working in full-time, and they were living in what looked like an outhouse with water all around and no plumbing, and all the money that they earned would only make you want to leave the country. I mean, they were working, and we set up these conditions whereby people cannot survive in these free zones, right? And then when they want to come here, we call them horrible names, we treat them awfully, and their lives are hell, really. And she's very lucky to have found you.
She didn't go into a lot of detail about the situation there in her village and in her personal life, but I can just say she does fear for her own life and for her son's life if she's forced to return. My daughter said she's the model of the mother that I want to be, provide him with love and security and opportunities and take care of his every need, but with firmness, and to bring him up in a way that will allow him to flourish.
And she's trilingual now, which shows that she's very bright, and I assume that when he goes to school, she'll go to school.
Oh, she's in school.
Learn a lot, that the culture kind of makes them be the other. And when you take them into your home, let me suggest you adopt a few people who are struggling to survive. When you take them into your home, they turn out to be wonderful. It's just that if you don't know them, you don't think about it. But if you are them, America is not the great land that the Statue of Liberty said, holding out its hands to others. And if people are here, we should welcome them. And we should be kind to them, and we should all be like Avi.
I don't know.
Use your mothering and spread it a little wider, especially when your kids go to college and you have all that love.